So we have two microphones. I'm going to hand one microphone here to Gabe, and I'm going to ask each of you to just briefly introduce yourselves. Talk a little bit about who you are and what you do. Please be so kind as to pass the mic down when you're done talking. And I will not start every time with Gabe when I ask questions, but I will start now for this introduction. Go ahead, Gabe.
Thank you, Richard. Oh, hello. Thank you all for coming. I know it's not so nice out there right now. Appreciate you making it. I'm Gabe. I'm one of the co-founders and CEO of Runway, which if you didn't know before, now you know what that is. Thank you, Richard. Can folks? Maybe, yeah. Let's see, former iOS engineer. So I come from that world, spend a lot of time building apps. I still have a side project that I have zero time to work on, but we guinea pig with it here at Runway. So that's fun. And yeah, that's about it. Thank you so much for coming.
Awesome. Hi, everyone. I'm Akanksha. I have the unique pleasure of being customers of both Sentry and Runway, which is why we're here. I work at DoorDash and I lead two teams, the client platform team and the merchant platform team, and they're all responsible for making sure our applications are healthy, fast, and error-free. I've spent about 2.5 years at DoorDash. Before DoorDash, I was at Netflix, and I spent 9 years there building Netflix.com. All right, over to you.
Hi, my name is Neil. I work here at Sentry. I've been here for 8 years. I lead our SE function. That's our solutions engineer. So, you know, if you guys are Sentry customers and you're writing on Slack or you're being demoed to, that's probably me and my team doing that. I like to say I'm an engineer helping our customer engineers. Outside of work, I like sailing, cycling, surfing, but not in this weather.
My name's Ty Smith. I work at Uber. I wear a lot of hats, but one of them is our platform lead for our mobile applications. I've been doing mobile stuff for a really long time at this point. It feels like my entire career, pretty much since kind of the beginning of iOS and Android. Have some former experience before Uber, also doing crash reporting. Was on one of the tech leads for Fabric. So I feel like there's a long history of observability and crash reporting. And at Uber, we do a lot of it ourselves. So unlike DoorDash, we have our own, big crash reporting and mobile release type of system. So that might be fun to talk about a little bit today. And I'm also one of the co-chairs of the Mobile Native Foundation, and we have Fastlane, another mobile release product under our foundation. So maybe there's a few interesting talking points here.
Fantastic. Thank all four of you. Ty, hold that microphone because we'll start with you. Also, if during this time you're thinking about the rain and you feel a little sad, just look at me. I'm dressed like if someone took a cool sun with sunglasses and had it come to life to make you forget all about the bad weather. You can just look at me and think of other things. So Ty, question to kick things off for everyone, but starting with you. Pretty simple starting question. What are the key metrics that your team uses to measure how a new app version is doing when you've released it?
That's a great question. So at Uber, we have a lot of applications that we distribute, a lot of different businesses. And we empower our product organizations that own those to have a lot of autonomy. So there's some convergence of what things we're looking for and also some unique business metrics in those as well. So there's a bunch of kind of table stakes that we expect when we're rolling out our applications in like the app health side. So that's like fatal-free rate, non-fatal rate. We have a bunch of contributing factors to that from crashes, ANRs, leaks, frame rate, battery drop, a bunch of different like degradation metrics that we all track in our internal systems and have automated systems around. And then each application typically has a lot of business metrics that are associated with that as well. Things like, if it's for the Uber app, that would be driver supply hours in the driver app, or for the rider app, that might be, number of core flow trips completed. And there'll be a lot of granular analytics that we're tracking for release version. And then that's coupled into the experiments that we're running at any one time as well, which can number in the thousands typically per application. So pretty robust data systems to kind of analyze and monitor the app rollouts.
Thank you. Pass it on to Neil. Neil, same question. I'll remind you what it is. What are the key metrics your team uses to measure how a new app version is doing? Now, obviously, you're at Sentry, so maybe you can use an example of what
Yeah.
you would recommend.
I don't have a production iOS or Android app at the moment, but I have written quite a bit of demo apps and work with customers of all sorts, of all scales that are trying to monitor their applications and performance using Sentry. Things that I'm seeing quite a bit of traction on are a lot of mobile vitals. So, you mentioned slow frames, frozen frames. That's pretty critical. In addition to the startup times, cold start, warm start. What's your first impression when you install the app, you click it, and it launches? Is it taking too long? If it takes too long, folks might not even get to, the base experience or whatnot. Or, when you launch it from the background into the foreground, and does it load properly? Other things that are coming up quite a bit are time to initial display and time to full display as well. And really, what we're seeing quite a bit of is, how do I get from one of these compromised metrics to the root cause of it as well? So I'll get into more in terms of like how profiling plays into this and whatnot. But all of this is kind of grouped together into mobile vitals, and those metrics are pretty important. In addition to what Ty said, which is not just these out of the box metrics, but incorporating what your business cares about into all of this, because sometimes there might not be a crash or an error, but there might be some type of conversion rate that falls out, or folks aren't able to add anything into the cart, so the items in the cart are much lower than what you would expect amongst your user base and such. But you got to figure out why that's happening, right? So I think that's my 2 cents on that.
Fantastic 2 cents. And we're going to come back to some of your points that you just made about other things outside of these sort of main things that are often measured. Let's have Akanksha take the microphone now.
Yep, I think very similar to what you heard. So there's the core quality metrics that we also monitor, like how long is the app taking to start up? What's the latency for each of our core pages? What's the success rate for those pages loading? We also look at like the core actions that both are. So we have a merchant app. We also have a consumer app. Like, what are the key pieces or key actions a merchant needs to take and consumer needs to take? What's the error rate for that? How long is it taking for them to do it? Like, add to cart durations is something we would monitor, for example. We'd monitor hitch rate, app hangs, app starts. On web, we would monitor things like TTI, like time to interactive, INP, all of those cool things. There's another piece I want to talk about, which is we say, how do you monitor metrics for different app versions? And what we have learned is version is not just you release an application with like a bunch of code. A version is also somebody turned on an experiment. A version is also somebody turned on a fast property, and now you have like an app that's crashing. And that's been the challenging part that my team's been trying to tackle, is like, how do you tie quality and all of these core business metrics to turning on a feature or turning on an experiment, which I'll talk about more like in the rest of the questions. But yeah, that's pretty much it.
Fantastic. I also like to thank the refrigerator for turning off just now, because it was very loud in my ear. So Gabe, why don't you close us out for this question?
Yeah, so I think we covered so much ground. I'm not going to repeat anything. I might call out a few, maybe one sort of out of left field item, and one thing that we have found, like talking to teams or working with teams, is not so impactful. When you hear people talk about like Aptix scores, these sort of roll up metrics that try to pull all this together and give you like an index to just watch, super reductive, first of all. And I think it's also sort of this false security blanket that hides a lot of what's underneath. Creates extra steps too. Okay, your Aptix score is down. You have an extra layer of triage to figure out like what's happening. So would stay away from that. And then the sort of out of left field thing that we see a little bit of focus on, our team's trying to do more with, is user ratings and reviews. It's really hard, especially if your app gets a ton of them. And DoorDash, if you wanted to look at their reviews and pinpoint app issues versus people complaining that their food was cold or arrived late, is an impossible task. So trying to get creative and find ways to sort of pull out these gems or hidden issues that surface in reviews that wouldn't even surface as crashes, as performance issues, even in key like business metrics and product analytics. We see some teams get creative there. So, yeah.
Fantastic. Why don't you pass it back down to Neil? So we'll start with him. Because my next question is outside of these sort of core ways of measuring app health, like crash rates and performance rates, which all of you have mentioned, things that are outside of this sort of standard things to measure. What else should people be measuring? Neil, you mentioned looking at like conversion rates on different pages. What should people really be drilling into outside of like just the sort of generic application health that just normally gets talked about?
Yeah, absolutely. So, here's a good example where, let's say you have like an e-commerce mobile app. You launch it up, you start on screen A, which is, just, where the app launches. Then you go to the inventory or the products page, and then you add some things to the cart, and then you go to checkout, and then hopefully you successfully check out, right? Now, your crash free rate, let's say you're not having any of these crashes per se, right? But let's say your backend endpoint is not returning what you expect, right? And therefore, let's say it's for some reason you're hitting your product's backend and you're getting back an empty array. At that point, you might not have an error, but you'll see that the number of items to cart is next to none because when they go to the products page, it's not rendering anything. So there might be some other metrics that also, show up saying that, hey, the products page is really, really fast to load, but that might not be believable. But, that's one signal. But the main signal here is that no one can add anything to cart. Is my add to cart button broken? Probably not. I don't see any errors as it, results into that. But you have to understand what happened before. So what we are experimenting here with at Sentry is what we call this critical experience monitoring, where we're looking at all of these individual pages or screens, depending on if it's a web app or a mobile app, and seeing if users are able to progress through this. And then we want to tie in certain metrics through this. And if a metric is off, hopefully you can hone in and then figure out kind of the root cause of it. If not, that's where, maybe you might want to look at a session replay, which we just launched for mobile as well, just kind of shout out. And then you can see that, hey, it's clearly nothing is rendering for the user. We also have things like screenshots as well. So hopefully, if there was some error tied to it, we will take a screenshot and kind of pin that on there to help you understand. But like I said, there might not always be an error as well. So, sometimes slow and fast is not just enough to understand that this is something wrong. Sometimes there may or may not be an error. And that's where you kind of have to rely on some of these other metrics to understand that something is really off and warrants investigation.
Fantastic. Pass it down to Akanksha. If you'd be so kind as to answer that same question.
What's the question we're asking? Measuring app health and user pain point outside of crash rates and performance?
That's exactly right. Measuring app health and pain points outside of crash rates and performance data.
Yeah, so one of the things I actually really love doing is actually going to the merchants and talking to them, because a lot of times none of our metrics would tell us what the merchant is telling us. Like, for example, I could build any amount of metrics around dasher arrival time, order completion, success, et cetera. When I go to the merchant, there's this lady not very, familiar with technology. She's like, oh, I don't know how to reduce the time of something. Like, if I want to make something, we have a default time, 10 minutes. I don't know how to reduce it because a smaller order, I can make it faster, right? So things like that, you would never see in your metric. You will never know that, oh, she was not clicking that one button and she didn't know it existed. And like things like these actually go inform our product roadmap. And yes, talking to one merchant doesn't mean that's a problem for all of that, but that's a starting point where we can start digging in more. So like hearing your customers out, and yes, there's like thousands of reviews on our app and lots of people on Twitter complaining about like the food and not the app quality, but there's also some nuggets we'll find from there. Like, I wish I had this on DoorDash, and we're like, yes, let's do it. So I think there's true customer obsession at DoorDash, and those insights we get from there.
Fantastic. Pass it on down to Gabe. What else should people be measuring? Like you really think beyond crash rates and performance data.
So I think I touched on the user ratings review stuff. Akanksha did too. It's cool to hear. That's huge. I think the biggest gap that we see reaching, I guess, the levels of a DoorDash, Uber, and the sort of breadth of what they look at, we find is in the sort of product analytics, business metrics area. I think probably most people in this room are on teams that are very familiar, comfortable with sort of the crash reporting side of things in a simple way, crash-free rate. The next step up is sort of those more product-focused, business-grounded metrics, I think. And so it's been talked about a little bit, but adding that to the mix and sort of pulling it out of this silo where it tends to live often at a certain scale with product. There's this huge kind of wall that exists, and product is over there. They have their charts. They're looking at it usually on a longer time scale, which also makes it harder to use for in the moment, sort of finding issues that need to be fixed quickly. Bring it out of that black box and sort of make it more actionable release to release, or layering on sort of experiments, because a release can be boiled down to a single flag being toggled on or off. So getting that kind of metric pulled out, visible, getting engineering involved with it, so it's not living across on this other side of the wall, I think is can be super, super impactful.
Please.
Something we learned, I just want to add one more thing. We just learned that a couple of days ago. So we added telemetry for our merchant app. We added telemetry for the top 25, let's say, most important actions for a merchant. And what we usually measure on any application is your error rate, success rate, and maybe a P75, right, for how long it's taking. This time we actually also measured how long does it take when something fails. And those numbers were shocking. So when something succeeded, let's say it takes 1 second. When it fails, it takes 10 seconds. So not only have you given a user a bad experience, you've also taken 10 seconds to do so, right? So I think that was a very interesting insight that we learned when we separated the success, metrics from the error metrics. And feel like it's probably a miss that a lot of people don't measure it, but should. All right, I'm going to pass it on.
All right, last one for me. I think a lot of good points have been covered here, so I won't repeat a whole lot of what's been said. I'll give a slightly different opinion, though. I think a lot of the metrics that your app will need to measure to be successful outside of just traditional crashes should come from your customer use cases, not just the business metrics, but understanding what drives your customers and what motivates them to use your application. So at Uber, that's for us, it's about reliability. Our users are transaction driven. It's a utility. They're trying to go somewhere. It's not it's not a browsing experience, not a consumer experience. It's not a social media application. It's not a video app, right? Those all have different metrics that they might want to track and different things they're trying to drive with engagement for their customer. For us, folks are trying to get somewhere, and it could be a very critical situation for them. It could be, they're going to the hospital, or they're trying to, go to work, or put food on their table, for their family. And so we treat, reliability at all costs as kind of the top level metric. And with that comes trade-offs that you can make. So I talked to, peers at companies like Pinterest or Instagram. And for them, it might be, extremely driven on frame rate performance, because they need ad revenue and they need very smooth scrolling in their feeds, and they need to maximize the number of ad impressions. Whoops. And so, they may look at new technologies coming out and make decisions based on those. An example is when Jetpack Compose came out for Android, the new UI rendering library from Google, declarative UI a few years ago. It had known performance problems. They weren't huge. It's 5 or 10% slower than standard views, but they were able to see business metric drop for the amount of revenue that they were seeing when they deployed that in their main feed. For us, with reliability, we had a little more flex to use that. And so we were making investments for maintainability and long-term direction, knowing that that would catch up, and we could start to make those investments now because our users, had a little bit of give and take for kind of what we were thinking about. And so, I would take for each one of your apps, like what is the major motivating factor for your customers, and then derive business metrics from those that you're tracking, not just every generic one, like do the carts complete, or, does my frame rate good, or whatever it looks like.
Fantastic. Now I'm going to skip my next question because I feel like you all have covered it very in detail from your answers. So I'm going to go next. We pass it down to Akanksha. So is there a signal that you feel like many teams aren't measuring and that you think they should be measuring right now, that they should start measuring?
I just gave an answer to that.
You did just
Which
answer
is
that.
like, yeah, how bad is it when it gets bad? I think that's one. I feel like performance also usually takes a backseat, especially like, the app startup, page load times. When we do, however, talk about performance, we talk about, okay, LCP is the metric people will use. It's like pages rendered, but not how responsive it is. When you clicked on something, did you get feedback immediately? So I think those are pieces that we usually tend to miss and prioritize, like crashes, and then it's errors, and then it's performance. Who do I
Pass it on.
it to?
Pass it to Gabe.
I'm gonna slightly not answer the question, maybe.
Fantastic.
But,
Please feel free to ignore me while you talk.
I think it's less. I mean, there's going to be plenty of examples of like stuff that you should consider adding into your mix of what you're monitoring. But there's another thing that I think teams can often do more of, which is apply rules and clear definitions of health to what they're monitoring. There's a lot of like, oh, let's create a bunch of dashboards and people look at them and like decide what to do with them and how to act, or in many cases not act. And I think the layer to add on top, again, to make it all actionable, is like rules, thresholds. Like, what does healthy mean for our app? When should action be taken? And having that really clearly defined for the team, not as a universal standard, because like, again, I think Ty, you were saying like different product teams really have a lot of ownership over their areas of the app, their metrics. Allow teams to define their own picture of health, of course, for their product, for their part of the product, but make it super clear and have this contract so there's no confusion when issues surface, and there's a really clear picture of when things need to escalate and when things should be triaged. There's a lot of reasons why that's good, but yeah, I would sort of consider adding that to the mix as well.
Excellent. Pass it down to Ty. So Ty, is there a signal that you feel like teams aren't measuring that they should be measuring right now?
It's a good question, and I gave a few high-level things earlier, so I'll give a more tactical recommendation now. It's very technical. There's some things that are easy to measure, and you see them in the default tools like Sentry or Bugsnag or any of these, and around some of your basic analytics, your stack traces, crashes, and mobile, maybe even ANRs. What I haven't seen a lot of maturity around yet is measuring memory leaks in production. Memory leaks are one of those interesting ones where the user doesn't have a negative immediate effect from a memory leak. They're additive, and the user has an experience later on that isn't easily debuggable or traceable back to that leak. You might have hundreds of those over a session that ends up in an out of memory error later on, and then your team debugging that will have a lot of challenges in connecting that back to where that leak or several leaks were happening. And so we've within the last year rolled out leak detection and production into our observability stack. And we're doing heap analysis and lifecycle detection and a bunch of interesting stuff there to create leak traces and plumb those back into our backend system for that. And then we can set up alerts and plug that into our all of the P9s that teams are tracking for fatal free anyway, and we can consider that like a top level health metric. And besides a handful of big companies, I don't think that's really being solved by the industry right now.
Good point. So I talked about mobile vitals earlier. I want to highlight two of them specifically because they typically don't come out of the box, which is time to initial display and time to full display. And the more complex your app is, right? You can't just wait to render everything. So you need to show something, make the user feel like, hey, we're doing something, we're getting there. That's where time to initial display comes in. And then understanding when is the app usable, when we're fully rendered, when things are settled, when all the listeners are hooked on. That's where time to full display comes in. And I want to click on Ty's point because on mobile, you have to be concerned about obviously memory, CPU, but these things are consuming battery the more you consume memory. So it's not just those two, but then understanding what price that pays on battery usage, for example, memory is going out of control, CPU is going out of control. That's definitely going to consume more battery. But think about if you're retrying your network requests constantly. So, testing and monitoring your app under constrained conditions and understanding how it behaves there is something that I'm seeing quite a bit on, especially if you have a global application where parts of the world don't have 5G connections like us, right? They don't have the network guarantee or network connectivity guarantees that we have as well. And on the Sentry front, we're actually very interested in using the profiling data that we have and popping these up as performance issues. So we haven't gotten there yet, but we look to let you know that, hey, memory has basically increased throughout this time, which likely means you're having a memory leak and you should probably do something about it, and not just having the user go to a dashboard and understand that, or go to a transaction and then to a span and then to a profile and then understand that that's happening, but just aggregating that into an issue, alerting them, and being like, hey, this is something that you might want to look into.
Fantastic. Pass it back to Ty. So my next question is, this is a lot of stuff that you're keeping up with. Is how do you keep track of all these different signals? How do you make sure that no important issues get missed or lost? Like, who's keeping track of what? What's going on?
That is a great question, and I don't have a great concise answer for that. It's in a large organization, there's a lot of people that care about different things, and you can build tooling and dashboards and everything to consolidate, create granular metrics or perhaps aggregate metrics, with different levels of leadership visibility, and they're going to care about it to different degrees. And I'm sure if you clicked into all the big companies, you'd find some story like that. But we have built a lot of our own in-house tooling as opposed to using too much off the shelf when it comes to this space in general. And so, we have done some interesting things to try to consolidate those into single systems, set up, smart alerting, velocity alerting, incident detection for teams, try to give them the information when it's relevant based on what we can determine, have smart models that are looking at the analytics and observability data that are being emitted and understand, the heuristics and are kind of predictive in some of that. And so I think it's a combination of these that we're driving forward and trying to improve the overall experience for our customers.
Excellent.
Yeah, one of the most common things I hear about monitoring and telemetry, especially as it relates to crashes and errors and exceptions, is that, great, I plug in some piece of software that hooks onto the crash handlers, that gets my Java Kotlin errors, gets my Swift or Objective-C errors as well, or native crashes. But then what the hell do I do with all of this? I only care about these ones. This is a specific component I own. This is the specific code paths I own. And this is where we've seen things like code owners come into play quite a bit. This isn't, adopted by everyone. And I believe code owners is just a GitHub thing at the moment. I'm not even sure if the other source code or code host providers provide it. But as I've seen organizations mature, they explicitly map the files, directories, components to certain individuals or teams. And then we want that alerting to only notify those folks. One of the most frequent things we hear is alerting fatigue with any monitoring solution, and it's real, all right? That's great, you're being alerted, but once you get alerted too much, you just don't know what to do. You kind of lose track of things, you lose faith in it, and then you become kind of pushed to the dashboard world, if that makes sense. And as a developer, like looking at a dashboard and looking at graphs is not what we do day to day. We write code. Hopefully that code gets shipped, maybe hopefully soon after that. And then we respond to that issues in the code if there are any. Then we go back to doing that same thing. So, I am seeing things like code owners coming, getting quite a bit of traction, and monitoring solutions tightly integrating in with that. And then I like to define code owners as like explicit ownership, where you've explicitly defined this area to be owned by these individuals. But there's also the room for implicit ownership. What about the last one who touched that code? Or, the person that edited that line? Think about using git blame to your advantage. Now, you can't just, do a git blame on master. You have to be release aware and then understand that, this release or this SHA made it into production, and then probably, blame based on that, Also, it's not perfect just because you take the topmost frame in the stack trace and then do a git blame on that. That might not be the individual. The problem might be 3 levels below that, right? What happens if the topmost frame is a library frame, right? So you got to look back at the in-app frames and things like that as well. So it's not a perfect science, but getting to a starting point where you can have someone that probably knows something about that code or probably owns that code is a better starting point than some random SRE or some random on-call engineer who's trying to respond to this. Yeah.
So I like the code owners thing. I wanted to add one thing that's interesting. So we take owners very seriously, and getting the alerts to the right team is very difficult, especially, we have 1,000 mobile engineers or so and lots of teams, and you want to make sure they're looking at the right thing. What's really interesting is the separation he was talking about in like stack trace identification. When you have a lot of teams creating libraries and platforms and everything, it can be idiomatic to try to drive for a fast fail model. Someone misused my API, I'm throwing an exception, you misused it. They perhaps didn't have proper testing, they misused it, it rolled out to production, now you're having an incident. Now, the identification of that in a system would look like, hey, that platform team's library is exploding. What's going on here? It's much more nuanced than that. There's misuse going on. So having systems that can be intelligent around trying to understand the difference there can be really important.
So when we started thinking about on-call and metrics, and yes, there's 50,000 metrics, and we try to set goals to say at the end of the year, we're going to get to schedule deploys for, we chose web as the first platform. And then the biggest piece that got us there was the decentralization of alerting, like you mentioned. We had the concept of product owners, similar to code owners, but we said, hey, search team, you actually own these bunch of alerts. So for example, for crash free rate, we broke it down by page. So now we don't just get paged for crash free rate going down below 999 or whatever. We also get paged if checkout pages, and that saved us so many times, and it's a much faster signal actually than just saying overall crash free rate dropped. So now we built those intelligences into the systems, and the person who gets paged hopefully is the one closest to the problem. And your end goal is really, if you're doing it perfect, you don't need to have a centralized on-call at all. Because one, the people who are closest to the problem are solving it. And then the second piece we tried to do is there was no pull model. So we don't have now, when a release is going on, someone sitting and monitoring it. So we took all of our telemetry and then we built SLOs around it. So If any of that degrades, make sure it's paging you. And it's a one sentence thing here, but getting the right people to be paged for the right thing is one of the hardest things I've done in life is, okay, no, this needs to go here. If this burns by this much, needs to go here. Oh, we actually set it up, but they decided to not have it page them, but go to a Slack channel. So, and like a lot of times you learn through incidents. So like getting that right, one of the hardest things organizationally, but the best things you can do, because now you've taken the problem away from depending on people to depending on tools, which are like objective, and there's homogeneity of outcome, right? Everybody gets paged the same amount, et cetera, et cetera. Gabe, you're next.
It is Gabe.
Yeah. All of that, I guess to sum it up, is like avoid the signal to noise problem. Make sure the right alerts are going to the right people and places, and also that the focus on specific metrics and thresholds that you might set for your team are owned by the right people. I guess to like add something new here, taking the step up sort of philosophically, I think what's important also to make this stuff more actionable and more noticed by folks is the empathy for the user. At the end of the day, folks like to ignore alerts, period, unless there's some sort of inherent desire or understanding or need to go fix the problem and address it. I remember as an iOS engineer, one of my favorite parts of the job was actually sitting it in on user interviews. We would go with like product or UX folks, and we'd sit and just like talk to users and watch them do stuff. And I truly believe it builds so much more empathy for the user, obviously, and that has this really awesome trickle-down effect where folks are going to care more about what they're building, and they'll care more about owning and responding to issues in the app. And so it's a few degrees removed, but I think that's sort of an interesting part of this to make this all more, to help people stay on top of it and make that actually work. There's another side to it, which can go the other way. I see this on my own team. Too much of that, folks are constantly jumping on bugs and wanting to fix things. Also not a good thing. And that's, again, where I think like the thresholds and the definition of health come in. There should be these rules where it's like, this is something that's going to be looked at now. This is something that gets slotted in for a later sprint. And there's no arguing it. That's just like the standard operating procedure. So yeah, there's two sides to the coin sometimes.
Thank you to all four of you. So I'm going to do one more question from this list before I hand it over to the audience for some questions. So my question for you, and we'll give it to Akanksha to kick it off. My question is, this doesn't need to be at your current role because we're talking about errors here, but can you describe a problem your team faced that had an unexpected cause or explanation that took time to find?
I think some of the harder challenges, I'll give an example, happened recently. So we're trying to release something, and we have checks in Runway to say if, crashes drop below a certain amount, alert us or stop the release, right? So Runway tells us that. We're like, okay, cool. Then we go to Sentry to figure out what's going on, right? And we found out that users on a certain iOS beta version were crashing for a specific version of our app. Would have never even imagined, okay, that would now cause our app to crash and for us to pause our rollout and all of that, and figuring out like a strategy for how to move forward. Is it a beta version that we support, don't support? So that was actually very interesting to learn. Like, it was a very small subset of users that were crashing and kind of bringing the whole crash free rate down.
Excellent. Let's pass it to Neil.
Yeah, I don't have a production iOS or Android app, as I alluded to earlier. But some things that I've now come to see happen more often than not, and folks don't typically know about it until it becomes a really bad problem, is when you're locking up the main thread. And then basically things increase in terms of slowness over time. Your alerts aren't firing off. Let's say, because you might have some alert that says, hey, if things slow down by 10%, then alert me. But then what happens is over time, it's much less, and it just creeps and creeps and creeps. And then that's where something like a dashboard and these definitions come into play, where you need a clear definition of once my app launch or cold start gets to this amount, it's absolutely unacceptable. Because over time, it is increasing by 5%, but that's not triggering my alerts. But I need a dashboard widget or a big number that turns red and tells me this is unacceptable, or a metric alert that says this is unacceptable. That's not just based off a percent, but it's based off absolute. So, that's what I'm seeing quite a bit of, like, folks inherit tech debt, and it gets to creeping on some metric, but then it doesn't become a problem until someone really realizes. And we just had a customer actually, where they're going into Black Friday. It's a big electronics in-person and e-commerce store, and they're doing more and more business through their mobile app. And the CEO used the app, and he's like, this is much different than when I used it a month and a half ago. Why is it so much slower? Why is it taking so long to render this component? And now that, started a top-down investigation into that, essentially.
So I'll give a story from my previous role before Uber. When I was at Twitter and we launched Fabric, which was the rebranding of Crashlytics, and it became an entire SDK suite with a lot of options. We did it at a big conference. It was at Twitter Flight, lots of fanfare, etc. And I had on the second day, I had an engineer come up to me, and I'd been, we'd all been heads down working on this for 6 months or a year coming up to the launch. And he said, when I use Fabric in my app, only in the release app, it's just freezing on launch and our application not responding, and it's unusable. We'd not seen anything like that. There wasn't any code that we had in the hot path that should be running on the main thread. So it's very surprising, but it does have to initialize. It's a crash reporting library, so you want to initialize it at app startup so you can monitor the entire thing. And so I sat with the guy, and we were trying to debug and trying to help reproduce, but it would only happen in his release builds. And finally, I had this theory that one of the new SDKs we launched was the Twitter embedded tweet SDK, and it had an ads SDK as well. And it was using the Android advertising ID. The docs for that say, in some situations, this can be run on the main thread. Very hand-wavy, generic Java docs. We're kicking this off on the background thread. It says sometimes it can do this. It's not open source, no information on when that is actually happening. We hadn't run into any of that. And in talking to the guy, it sounds like he had a bunch of advertiser SDKs and other things in there, and he was initializing them all at the startup. So I had an idea. It was like an ordering problem, and we could make some adjustments, and it might resolve his issue. But we couldn't reproduce it. We couldn't, get him a build that he could use, because we hadn't open sourced it yet either. And so I ended up using decompiler tools and decompiling his release builds, and doing the same to a compiled version of our release SDK, and then taking the Smalley and doing a bytecode reordering, and then recompiling his app back into a usable app, and verifying that the change I thought was going to fix it actually fixed it in his release build. And it was a very interesting debugging and customer empathy exercise, and ended up taking that back to the team and kind of walking them through how to think through that entire thing. Very cool.
If you pass it down to Gabe here now, imagine how many cool errors you would see if you were at Twitter now. I mean, or at X, the everything app. You would see some incredible errors, I think. But anyway, Gabe, take it away.
Yeah. A couple things come to mind. One, the classic crash before your crash reporting library has initialized. That can be a hard one to track down if you're not looking for it. And then the other example that came to mind when I was thinking about this question, again, a bit of a out of left field one, but I had a startup in college. It was an app. It was a sort of two-sided marketplace. you make requests and get deals or offers and stuff. Pretty basic stuff. And so we had, as one of the vendors on there, Emarino. Does anyone know that gelato place? I don't know if they're out here. Anyway.
No gelato fans in the audience right now.
Gelato fans. Yeah, we got one.
Okay, we got one.
Anyway, and that's not a humble brag. It's sort of relevant. They're a big gelato company in Europe, and they have a New York location. And they had some. They were on the platform. There was the ability to have these sort of automatic responses. So a user would come on, they'd be like, "I feel like ice cream in this location, this neighborhood in Manhattan," and then vendors could, based on certain rules, they could automatically respond with like deals or offers to, excuse me, get that user to come in. But used very sparingly. And for a company like this, they didn't have these automatic rules on too much. And so we started noticing this pattern. There were these two users in the app. Every Friday afternoon, something like that, they'd make this request. They were in like Greenwich Village, they wanted ice cream. And then they would immediately always get like 50% off at Amarino for gelato. And it kept happening week after week. And we were like, what is going on? There must be something broken with like the automatic rule system. Like these users have just like hacked the system. They keep getting this like awesome ice cream deal. And we eventually realized that no, actually the general manager for North America of Emarino was receiving the request and responding to the same users all the time. They get info about like who it is and just always giving them 50% off every week on Friday. And as another good example, I guess, not to bring this full circle of just like see the full picture, I guess, of what's happening. It's not even always down to these measurable things or these hard numbers that you can track. Like have that full picture, have the user empathy. There can be these weird scenarios that surface that you wouldn't even thought of. So yeah, it's maybe a weird one again, but
Great. I mean,
it's interesting.
I just had like serious deja vu. I feel like I've heard you tell that story, and I don't think I've heard you tell it before. I feel like I've heard you tell it like 10 times. I think I may be reliving this day over and over again. Possibly, but at different times in my life. I've just stepped in the frame. For anyone watching this on video, I've been mostly a disembodied voice, but now I'm an embodied voice. And see if I can like block each person equally while I talk here. We're going to go to the audience for questions. I was going to say, one of my favorite stories, one of my closest friends, I just went to his wedding at a company called Weebly, another company I worked at before Sentry and then Runway. Our app used to go down and stop working like every 3 days. And so would our website. And so would all the websites we hosted. We were website hosts. We hosted like 20 million websites. This would always go down. Everything would go down. And I built a support team, so I was very stressed out all the time. I'm very much calmer now. I wear very bright colors. But my favorite thing is the first time I ever interacted with my friend who's an engineer, as he was laughing because he found the problem that caused the website to go down. And I was just a ball of nervous energy. And I went up and like, "Are you laughing? You just took the website down. Are you laughing? We're going to get like 10,000 emails about this." And he just said, "Sorry, Dad." And that was that was our first great interaction, was a "Sorry, Dad." And that's how I interacted with all the engineers at Weebly. And if you worked with me, that's how I would interact with you, is you would be mad at me and then we'd become friends. It'd be great. But anyway, now I want to turn this over to the audience to ask questions of our panel. Are there questions out here in the audience? Raise your hand if there are. I see a question. Please say your question into the microphone.
Okay. Akanksha, I think you mentioned that as you're tracking performance of a rollout, that's both a mix of release code and experiments turned on. You mentioned that's hard to handle. What solution have you landed on so far for that?
Yeah, so release is easy because you know you're releasing now, so you have a kind of moment in time where you can look at before and after. For experiments, we basically now also tie all of our performance metrics to the experiment itself. So we look at like control versus treatment, what's the page load duration for control versus treatment, and then we build rules around that where if you degrade below a certain amount, we don't let you roll out.
And then do you ever see interactions between different experiments that you narrow down? Or like you have an issue that only comes up when the user is in these two separate buckets?
These two, so I think What do you mean by like these two separate buckets?
Meaning, suppose your team is tracking one experiment that's rolling out, but
Yeah.
if the user got into an experiment a different team's rolling out alongside yours and has an issue.
I see. Okay, so I think that's just the beauty of random like experiment, which is like the randomization and then the p-values. So if you see a user in experiment A and experiment B, but only experiment B is showing you issues, it's most likely experiment B versus like it's the way the experiments are randomized that you start seeing stat sig signals from certain experiments.
So do you have like internal tooling to measure how each of them is doing?
Yes.
Cool.
Yeah. So like on an per experiment basis, we can now tell that people in the control version of an experiment had a better or worse experience than a treatment version for our quality metrics.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Are there any other questions out there? I see a hand up. Please state your question into the microphone.
Hello. My name's Ryan. Nice to meet you. So I guess I had a general question for, I guess, anyone on the panel. But my question revolves around the idea of security. And let's say there's a release and then user data gets leaked. Do you have any like metrics in place or any strategies to help like detect that or mitigate like these security threats?
Yeah. So to confirm your question, it's about the user's like the user being on a fraudulent build or the user's credentials leak, or what part of the security from the user's perspective?
Yeah, I guess like credentials leak, let's just say, for example.
Yeah. So we have both client side and back end data side protection for those sorts of things happening. Usually that's based on a mix of like security tooling and heuristics and fraud signals and a bunch of big data that's kind of crunching to look at that sort of thing. From the individual's perspective, there can be tools that'll like scan for seeing matched credentials and send notifications if it was like in a previous leak, and we've seen stuff like that in the past. But then from the company's perspective, there's also the concern about like the user potentially being on broken devices or fraudulent activity and trying to detect that en masse, and that kind of overlaps heavily with the security space as well, because you could have a lot of those being taken advantage of by specific security vulnerabilities. So it's kind of a cat and mouse game, as in most big companies. And then, we have your typical bug bounty program and large organizational effort to, curtail those sorts of things.
Thank you for the question. I see another hand up. I am running towards you. Here you go.
Yeah. Is it on? Okay. So you mentioned, I like the idea of adding the technical metrics with the more business focused metrics, and that's something that we try to do. However, what would your recommendation be when you're at a small organization and these metrics, you may have a customer data platform, but you also have Sentry and you also have Datadog, and everything's kind of stretched across, so you don't really have the resources to build and roll your own. So what would the recommendations be there?
Yeah, good question. This comes up quite often in my day-to-day, where folks have, Sentry was birthed in error monitoring, right? And has now moved into other different types of monitoring as well, with the developer persona in mind. Then you have something like Datadog, which kind of started on the metrics side, on the dashboarding side, then went into infrastructure, APM, and then has taken kind of the infra to back end and now going to developers. And then we have product analytics, it could be something like Amplitude or something like that, right? And now you have 3 different data sets in 3 different places. What do I do, right? So one, it would be great to have everything in one, but that's not always doable, right? For many reasons. For example, I'll be honest, like Sentry doesn't track metrics today. We did for a brief moment in time, and now we're revisiting our metric strategy and going from there. But we're about to introduce the ability to attach metrics to spans, essentially. So you can attach almost all of these business metrics to a certain span, and then we're working on the technology to index these spans, aggregate these spans, query them, and so forth. So we're trying to get into that place where you can define your own metrics and be able to dashboard them, display them alongside errors, crash rates, performance, and startup times and mobile vitals and all of that as well. What Sentry is not going to get into is infrastructure metrics. So the metrics that we are interested in is application level metrics that developers would care about. And then comes, product analytics, where you're trying to measure basically a funnel, essentially. And, some folks know it as user journeys, some folks know it as funnel analytics and such like that. And there's always going to be some type of use case that PMs and designers want to look at that data for. But as a developer, you want to understand if the funnel is compromised, essentially, not how to optimize each area of the funnel. So as we go into kind of this metrics territory, we're even thinking about new visualizations that we can do in terms of our dashboards and things like that, because a simple bar graph or a simple line graph or a simple big number doesn't quite do it. So that's not a straightforward answer, but the division that we kind of see out there is your backend and infra folks are more inclined of using kind of the data dogs of the world, essentially. What we want is our application developers to be able to use Sentry to track anything that might have to do with the application experience as it relates to crashes, errors, exceptions, performance, and so forth. And then if any of that's compromised, we want to feed it into something like Runway, where you can probably automatically roll back or hot fix or something like that. And that's kind of the next evolution that we're seeing, is taking these metrics and then being able to do something to retroactively get into a stable state, essentially, as fast as possible, because that's kind of the only way you can get to 4 nines, essentially, right? So that is kind of what we're seeing. So stay tuned, more to come, but that's kind of persona driven at the moment, if that makes sense.
I'll jump in with a quick answer. That aggregation of all these signals and from different tools, the sort of specialized tools set that's going to be tracking all this stuff, as you probably know, Phil, is one of the things that Runway specializes in and what we're focusing more and more on. So you can already connect up your Sentry, your Datadog, your Amplitude, your Mix Panel, whatever it might be, GA, pull in user reviews and ratings, get the dashboard out of it. There's a lot more we want to do there, but then also act on it intelligently, either alerting or actually taking action out into the stores. So the quick shout for Runways, we're definitely trying to do that and have more coming there with the ability to stream in any data from anywhere and have that plug into the same system. Layering on experiments, feature flag data is also in focus right now. So very much trying to be that single source of truth. Without necessarily being your whole stack. There are specialized tools that have been around forever that do this. Yeah.
That being said, when we do see customers that have a bunch of different technologies where they're tracking different things, what I do advise folks is to basically dynamically assemble some sort of tag value that can get you from one system to another, right? Let's say, you have the user ID, essentially, right? And you might have your business metrics in some other system. But from the Sentry error, you should be able to click some link and hop into wherever your business analytics is and get to that page where you're showing the view for that page or for that user or so forth. So a lot of these telemetry and analytics systems do have the ability to set context, set tags. It's about just being able to roll up your sleeves and see if we can kind of get to a place where we can hop in from one system to another, such that we don't have to start from scratch from a dashboard or like the landing page in one of the solutions and such.
Cool, powerful question. That led to two powerful answers about Sentry and Runway. Very good. Any other questions out there? I see another question. I am coming towards you, which you can see, but the people watching this and recording can't see that, so I have to narrate the entire thing. Here you go.
As someone who's kind of in a technically adjacent role, so I don't work in either tech or mobile, for someone who's interested in breaking into this space, what skills or foundation would you say is necessary to be able to have a good start?
Learn to code. I think that it's pretty critical. At any company, you could be successful in any tech company, even if your job isn't necessarily being a software engineer, being aware of the product that's being built and having some understanding into how that's going. You could go as, examples here. Maybe it's a tech writer role, and having some basic understanding of coding can serve you in your day job, all the way to, a software engineer whose entire job is coding. But I've seen very successful, designers, product managers, execs, the more folks that want to work in tech understand kind of the guts of what make that work, the more successful I see them.
I think for me, one of the things that we look at, like when we hire as well, more junior folks, is try to ignore almost completely like experience in particular languages and that kind of thing. I think at that entry level, people can get so caught up in like, where should I start? Which language, which framework, this technology, that technology. It's this huge kind of echo chamber that just like you get drowned in. And yeah, that will come. Like you'll become specialized in particular languages or frameworks, but be good at problem solving. Like start there. And there's so many different ways to do that and different ways to show that, I think, in interview processes. So like don't get caught up in the like the language rat race.
Yeah, +1 to both what Ty and Gabriel said. One of the other things I've realized is it's not just about like opening the text editor, being able to write some piece of code, or just get an app running locally, but also just understanding the software development lifecycle and its nuances. Like one of the questions that I'm going to spill some beans here, but I even ask in some interviews is that why is the mobile release cycle or deployment cycle so much different than web? And, I ask this to even folks, even someone who might be interviewing for our events coordinator role, essentially, right? And then they don't really quite understand why. Then I'm like, think of yourself as a user. Like, when do you get the updated app? And they think about it. They're like, oh, when I go to the app store and I click update, or it auto updates. And then I'm like, what about people like me who have the auto update turned off? They're like, oh, that means that there's multiple releases out there and you're not going to get the new one until you actually go to, on Android, so until you actually go to the Play Store and update, essentially, right? So understanding the nuances of all of these different verticals, essentially, right? So think about like the gaming industry. Like when a crash happens, why is it so critical in video games? Because when I'm playing Call of Duty and I'm there with 63 other players, and when that game crashes, it ruins the whole game, essentially. And that is 63 other people that are impacted by that, not just me as well. So, understanding kind of the software development lifecycle, understanding the nuances of the app, the use case, the platform that you're developing on, I think is pretty key as well. But I think it does begin with learning how to code and understanding what's happening under the hood. Depth is really hard to achieve. And I do agree that doesn't matter if you know 10 programming languages, especially now with tools that can help you code, like GitHub Copilot, or you can ask ChatGPT to, hey, write me a React Native app that does A, B, and C, and it'll output maybe something usable, or at least a good starting point. I think that there's tools out there that'll help you get your launchpad, but understanding the fundamentals is key when it comes to coding and such like that. And then understanding how to get that code tested and deployed is pretty key in my opinion.
And also knowing what companies care about errors. If you're playing Call of Duty and errors are a big deal, it ruins the game for everybody. But if you're playing Skyrim, errors are simply a charming part of the Bethesda culture that they intend to make part of the gaming experience. Any follow-ups for that? Are you good? Okay. So we are now coming close to the end. So I think we will call it there because it's almost 8 o'clock. So I'm going to walk back up into frame briefly. And wave at you all as I do so. So let's give a round of applause for our speakers, for Gabe, for Akanksha, for Neil, for Ty. Thank you all for being here so much. We're now going to, or at least I am, and some of us are going to go over to 83 Proof around the corner. So if you'd like to join and hang out and talk, we will be at 83 Proof doing so. Again, not everyone will necessarily be there, but I certainly will, and I think Gabe will too. So anyway, we'll hopefully see you there. Thank you. And thank you to Sentry for hosting this. And thank you for Runway for pointing it on.